3, added dissonance chords. So in this video, we're going to talk about what added dissonance chords are, which is basically a concept that expands beyond seventh chords. It has a lot of really similar features, but is essentially adding more chromaticism to your chords. Let's get started. So what is an added dissonance chord? Well, the term added dissonance chord is the collective name for 9th, 11th, and 13th chords. Note that we're not going to use the jazz term for this, which is extension, simply because we're going to be using that term later in the course for another concept in the form unit, and I don't want to get them mixed up. In classical style, these things are typically called added dissonance chords, although they do function in very similar kind of ways. Like seventh chords, added dissonance chords include extra dissonances that are stacked above the root third and fifth of the chord. So much in the same way that we added a seventh by adding another note a third above, we're going to keep on adding notes that are a third apart to create our 9th, 11th, and the 13th of our chord. So in our example, for example, on a G major chord, G, B, and D, we stack up another third to get our 7th F, we stack up another third to get our A, up another third to get our C, up another third to get our E. When you do this process, you're going to use the accidentals that belong to the key and that match the chord at this given location. So if I was in the key of C major here, for example, I'm not going to add any accidentals to my 9th, 11th, or 13th when I add them in. And so just remember that your accidentals will match whatever the key of the chord is. When we use 9th, 11th, or 13th, we don't normally include all of the added dissonances. You'll just choose one out of the 9th, 11th, or 13th. So as you can see in my examples, that's going to create some spacing between the notes, and that's 100% okay. You'll also notice in my examples that I have omitted the fifth of the chord. This is a very standard procedure when you're writing in 4 parts. Obviously, if we want to include something like a 9th, if we include all the notes of the chord, then we have 5 notes. It doesn't quite work in 4-part writing. So it's a very standard procedure to include the root, third, 7th, and then whatever the added dissonance note is. In terms of voice leading, it turns out you actually already know the rules for this. The added dissonance note, in other words, the note that is the 9th, 11th, or 13th, must be treated in the same way as what we learned for 7ths. In other words, we need to prepare that note and we need to resolve that note. And the rules for preparing and resolving turn out to be exactly the same as what we learned for 7th chords. We want to prepare by common tone if possible, and we want to resolve down by step if possible. But if that's not possible based on the notes available in the previous chord or the subsequent chord, then we essentially go down our list of options to choose our next best option. So in my example here in G major, the E constitutes the 9th of my 5-9 chord. I prepared that by common tone because that E does exist in my previous chord, and I was able to move out of that E by step because my D did exist in my next chord. Let's have a listen to what that sounds like in this progression. There's a few other parameters that I'm going to ask you to do when composing with added dissonance chords this semester, although we're going to relax these a little bit next semester. I'm going to ask you to keep the added dissonance note in the soprano voice. Why? Well, because the added dissonance note is going to sound quite dissonant in the chord, and if we put it in the soprano voice, it becomes really obvious that we intend for that note to be there. That is not just a mistake that we've made, but that we're putting it there intentionally. I'm also going to ask you to keep the chords in root position when you're using them this semester. And part of the reason for that is that their identities can be kind of hard to figure out if you put them in inversion. So if you take a look at my 5-9, for example, if I had had C in my bass, it could look like this is a C, E, G chord that then maybe has a 9th or an 11th added to it. It would be hard for us to figure out the chord identity. Keeping the chords in root position allows us to very strongly hear what the root of the chord is. Once again, we'll relax these rules when we get to Music 293, where our focus shifts to Romantic-era style and more adventurous uses of harmony. I would like to point out that added dissonance chords retain their original harmonic function. So just because we add a 9th, 11th, or 13th, it doesn't change anything about how we hear the chord in the context of the progression. It still will keep dominant function or subdominant function and so forth. All it does is it adds more dissonance, which increases the tension somewhat, but sometimes we want that added tension. In classical style, added dissonances are most commonly added to 5-7, 7-7, and 2-7 chords. Jazz, on the other hand, tends to use them much more extensively. So once again, like I was talking about in the 7th chord video, some of this is going to depend on style more than anything else. In this class, I'm going to ask you to avoid added dissonance on other chords, with the exception of our pop music unit. While added dissonances are used on other chords in the late 19th and early 20th century, the styles that we're going to be modeling in this class are classical and early romantic style. And these two styles do not use 9ths, 11ths, or 13ths beyond the chords that I've just listed above. So it does vary by time period, but because we're just at the learning stage with these chords, we're going to restrict ourselves to what would typically be done in the classical era, the era where they were first introduced. Students often ask how to indicate inversions with added dissonance chords. There's a couple different systems that are in play depending what textbook that you end up looking at. Some textbooks use much more complex labels than what I'm going to do. But in this class, what I'm going to ask you to do is simply use the 7th chord inversion symbols plus an extra 9, 11, or 13 on top of them to indicate the inversions to the added dissonances when they appear. Most times you're going to see these chords in root position anyways, so you're not going to encounter this all that often. But the other textbooks that use the more complex symbols basically measure intervals above the bass, and the stack just gets really big at this point. So it can be a little bit confusing to see those extended symbols. We tend to hear added dissonance chords as simply a 7th with an extra note added onto it anyways, so that's why I'm going to use the 7th chord inversion symbols here. Some of you have probably pretty quickly figured out already by my diagram that I'm missing an inversion here from the possible ones that are listed. I've shown the 4 inversions that are possible per 7th chords. Technically, you could invert this thing and put the added dissonance in the bass, but that makes the chord extremely difficult to identify. Because it's very difficult to identify the chord when the added dissonance is in the bass, these 4th inversion added dissonance chords are rarely used, and so you don't need to worry about learning an inversion for them. You're just straight up not going to come across them. I'll also mention in connection to the diagram here, it should be a single bracket, for example, around the 6-5. I just can't do that on computer notation. So when we do go to doing this live, you'll notice that rather than a bracket around the 6 and a bracket around the 5, I'm just going to put one big bracket around both of them. Lastly, I often notice this phenomenon when I teach this concept, where students, now that they know that 9ths, 11ths, and 13ths exist, start to spot them everywhere. But it turns out that sometimes a 9th, 11th, or 13th actually results from non-chord tone motion. In other words, it's there because it's a passing tone, or a neighbor note, or a suspension. When this happens, we're generally going to hear these things as non-chord tones rather than true added dissonances. But it can be useful to note that they're there in some cases, just because they can prepare chords in different ways, and they can also give us more possibilities for introducing dissonances much more smoothly. I'm going to use the term apparent added dissonance in this situation. And this is a form of contrapuntal chord, which I've mentioned in a previous video. In other words, it looks like it could be a different chord on paper, but it's just there because it's resulting from non-chord tone motion. So in our example, I've highlighted 2 places where this is happening. In my 4 chord, I've got a D, which is a passing tone between my E to C. And then in my 5 chord, I've got a B, which is a passing tone between the previous C and the following A. Let's have a listen to what this sounds like. Technically, if I was working purely looking at the paper, I might want to say, well, that D that's there is a 9th in the 4 chord, and that B that happens is a 13th in the 5 chord. But the question is whether we actually hear them that way. If we're hearing them that way, we're going to hear a very, very strong emphasis on that dissonance, and it's going to sound like it's part of the chord. I don't think that's actually what we hear. Let's listen to the progression one more time and see how we're perceiving those notes. Do they feel like they're part of the chord, or do they feel like they're just passing through? You'll notice in both cases, they really do have that passing through feeling to them. They don't sound like a moment where we could stop and just hang out there for a while. And so as a result, we're not going to hear them as added dissonances. We're just going to hear them as passing tones. So we don't, in that case, need to indicate them in the figures. All right, to finish up, let's go through one analysis example. We'll start by having a listen to the piece. So Franck's Sonata for Violin and Piano uses these added dissonances pretty prominently at the beginning. I haven't indicated them yet for you, but I did want to point out just the underlying structure of the harmony here before we get going. This piece is in A major. It starts with a really, really long 5 chord, which then goes to 2, 5, and 1, the SDT portion of a TSDT. You'll notice sort of a floating ethereal kind of feel to this piece when you listen to it. And part of that is created by the voicing, but another part of that is created by the fact that we have these notes hanging in there that aren't necessarily part of the bass triad that we're working from. And that becomes particularly prominent in the 5 chord. Let's break that chord down. The 5 chord in A major is E, G sharp, and B. E is the root, G sharp is the 3rd, and B is the 5th. But as you can see on the score, by the blue highlighting that I have here, there are a ton of notes that actually don't fit into just this foundational triad. So let's think about what notes would constitute added dissonances if we had them in this chord. If we had a 7th in this chord, that would be D. If we had a 9th, that would be F sharp. If we had an 11th, that would be A. And if we had a 13th, that would be C. So we're going to notice pretty quickly that some of these highlighted notes actually do fall into those added dissonances or count as the 7th. In our first bar, we have D and F sharp that are being prolonged throughout the entire measure. D is the 7th of this chord, and F sharp is the 9th. We would not consider this just a non-chord tone because it actually lasts the full duration of the chord. It's not moving partway through. We hear it pretty prominently. Non-chord tones, on the other hand, are going to subdivide the chord. The F sharp is also prolonged throughout this entire period. So that's pretty conclusive evidence that we're going to hear this thing as a 5-9 chord. And in the first 5 bars, what we essentially get are just shifts of inversions in those 5-9 chords. Every second bar, we're switching to second inversion, which is represented by 4-3. The 7-5, by the way, is just indicating root position for 7th chords. In our second last bar of this example, that exact same 5-9 chord comes back. We've got the D and the F sharp being held in the accompaniment parts, and there's an extra emphasis on that in the melody as well. We heard that 2 bars earlier, but it comes back here, essentially an alternation between the D and the F sharp. The composer is putting that in a prominent melodic voice to basically say, yeah, I mean for these notes to be here. These aren't just here by accident. The 5 then moves to a 1 chord, resolving dominant to tonic exactly the way that we would expect in a typical SDT portion of a progression. I will point out, some of you are probably wondering why I didn't analyze that last chord as a 6 chord instead of a 1 chord. The F sharp is actually just a suspension from the previous chord. Because F sharp is considered a chord tone as the 9th, it can essentially be held over in the same way that we would with a suspension, like we see in the accompaniment parts, or a delay, like we're seeing in the melodic voice. So you're going to continue analyzing in this sort of format on perusal in your group analysis. You're going to take a look at Mendelssohn's Song Without Words, number 9, and you're going to take a look at measures 1 to 12. The questions you're going to ask in your group, you're first of all going to try to figure out Roman numerals for everything. There's a few tricky spots, so I'm going to ask you to just guess in a few places where maybe you're unsure. But the other thing you're going to come across is there are a number of areas where there's a melodic voice that keeps moving, or there are additional notes on top of just the root 3rd and 5th of the chord. So you need to make a decision in each case about whether it constitutes a 7th, 9th, 11th, or 13th. Or, on the other hand, maybe it's just non-chord tone motion of some kind. The way you're going to make that decision is that you're going to listen to the recording and you're going to ask yourself, does this note feel like it's part of the chord, or does it feel like I'm moving through it and I need to continue to somewhere else? If you're moving through it, that suggests it's a non-chord tone. If it feels like it blends with the other notes of the chord, then that's suggesting that it's an added dissonance note. Good luck with your analysis. I'll check in with you online. Thanks for watching.